We often think of the Great Flood as a divine punishment for human wickedness, a simple case of mankind losing its moral compass. But that is a sanitized lie we tell ourselves to sleep better at night. The waters were not sent to drown men, but to drown monsters. Before the rain began to fall, the earth was not ruled by kings or emperors, but was a slaughterhouse run by entities that should never have existed. These were the days before the deluge, a time when the boundary between the heavens and the earth was shattered, not by war, but by a divine experiment gone horribly wrong. The Lord God had sent down 200 entities from his own angelic entourage, beings of light and power known as the Watchers. Their mission was explicitly passive, a directive of absolute non-interference handed down by the Creator himself. They were to oversee the mortal children of earth, to guide the delicate trajectory of humanity from a distance, but never to touch, never to meddle, and never to reveal themselves. Entrusted to the leadership of Semyaza, the most senior of the Watchers, this angelic host was meant to be the silent guardians of a fledgling species, ensuring God's intentions were fulfilled without breaking the fragile laws of reality. For a time, the silence held. Semyaza and his legion observed the delicate humans from afar, drifting like invisible clouds over the early settlements of man, providing subtle guidance that felt more like intuition than intervention. But the distance between the divine and the mortal is a dangerous precipice. As the Watchers hovered over the earth, the clinical detachment required for their task began to erode, replaced by a creeping, insidious fascination with the beauty of mortal women. It started as curiosity, but it festered quickly into an overwhelming, consuming lust that defied the very nature of their existence. Semyaza, the high commander who was supposed to be the paragon of restraint, felt his resolve disintegrate, his fear of God eclipsed by a hunger for flesh that was too intrusive to resist. In an act of cosmic treason, they descended. 200 angels plummeted from their station, crashing into the mortal bloodline with devastating force. They took human women for wives, violating the sanctity of the separation between heaven and earth. And in doing so, they impregnated them with a seed that was never meant to take root in human soil. But the physical violation was only the first wave of the catastrophe. The Watchers didn't just bring lust, they brought forbidden information. Azazel, a high-ranking Watcher who craved chaos, went a step further than mere procreation. He became the architect of humanity's destruction by teaching men the art of warfare. He whispered the secrets of metal and fire, showing them how to forge swords and shields, how to fight, and how to kill with efficiency rather than necessity. Magic and dark sorcery spilled from the lips of the Watchers like poison, disseminating the untold wisdom of the angels to a species that lacked the maturity to wield it. The world instantly tipped into chaos. Wars erupted over nothing, rapes were committed with impunity, and the carefully cultivated societal balance of mankind was overthrown by the appetite of fallen angels. Yet the true horror was growing quietly in the wombs of the women they had taken. When the offspring of this unholy union finally burst forth, they were not human, and they were certainly not divine. They were biological abominations. From the wombs of their mothers erupted the giants, violent, hideous beings with appetites that were ravenous and insatiable. These were bulbous, grotesque creatures, sporting mismatched eyes that burned with an alien fire, and angry snarls that promised only pain. Their bodies were impossible constructs of muscle and bone, heavy-set and dense, with arms as thick as ancient logs and legs as firm as tree trunks. To hold them was to touch ice, for they were cold, yet inside them burned a chaotic, hateful spirit that was purely evil. They grew with terrifying speed, outpacing the natural order, driven by a metabolism that demanded constant fuel. The devastation was total and absolute. They acted like a plague of locusts made of meat and bone. First, they devoured the harvests, stripping the fields bare in days. When the grain was gone, they ate the grass, then the trees, and then the forest itself, picking the landscape clean until the earth was nothing but barren dirt. Driven by an unending hunger, they turned their jagged teeth toward the animal kingdom. They slaughtered the birds, the cattle, the fish, and even the wild beasts of the field, emptying the land of all life just to fill their cavernous bellies. And when the animals were vanquished, when the silence of a dead world settled over the plains, they turned their gaze toward the only food source left, mankind. They snatched up humans like snacks on a platter, devouring the very people their fathers were sent to protect without a second thought. In a matter of weeks, humanity was scattered, their homes destroyed, their lives ruined by the sons of the angels they once revered. But even human flesh could not sate them forever. When the giants ran out of people to terrorize, they turned on each other, cannibalizing their own brothers in a frenzy of blood and madness. The world had become a graveyard, but as the giants sat amidst the bones of a ruined civilization, the silence was about to be broken by something even more terrifying than hunger: a conscience. We assume that evil is a mindless force, a hurricane of teeth and claws that destroys without thinking. But the true horror of the Nephilim wasn't their hunger. It was their awakening. It is easy to kill a monster that is purely instinctual, but it is infinitely more terrifying when that monster begins to feel regret. After the slaughter, after the lush forests were reduced to splinters and humanity was hunted to the brink of extinction, a strange and unsettling silence fell over the desolate earth. The adrenaline of the kill faded, and with nothing left to consume, the giants were forced to do the one thing they were never designed for. They started to think. In the void left by their destruction, these godlike abominations began to congregate, forming packs not unlike the primitive tribes of the men they had just devoured. They huddled around massive campfires that burned with the timber of dead civilizations, and as the orange glow illuminated their twisted, titanic faces, a new contagion spread through their ranks. It wasn't a plague of the body, but of the mind. For the first time, the sons of the Watchers felt the cold, creeping fingers of paranoia, doubt, and a paralyzing sense of impending doom. It began in their sleep. The Watchers had given them strength, but they could not shield their offspring from the subconscious intervention of the divine. Sleep, once a respite for the wicked, became a theater of judgment. They were plagued by visions so vivid and terrifying that they woke up screaming, their massive chests heaving with sweat and terror. Among them was a giant named Mawe, a creature who seemed more attuned to these cosmic frequencies than his brothers. One night, under a sky choked with smoke, he broke the heavy silence of the camp. His voice, usually a rumble that shook the earth, trembled with vulnerability as he recounted a nightmare that felt less like a dream and more like a sentence. He described plunging into water, a dark, suffocating abyss, where he found a stone tablet. When he pulled it from the depths, the water washed away the grime to reveal 4 names etched into the rock: Noah, Shem, Japhet, and Ham. The names meant nothing to the gathered horde, yet they carried a weight that crushed the air out of the camp. Mawe looked into the fire, his mismatched eyes wide with a realization he didn't want to accept, and whispered that this was an omen. It was a list of survivors, and none of their names were on it. The fear in the camp was palpable, a physical weight pressing down on their shoulders, until it was shattered by the arrogance of Ohia. As the son of Semyaza, the leader of the fallen angels, Ohia carried a hereditary pride that refused to bow to fear. He stood up, his shadow stretching long and menacing across the dirt, and sneered at Mawe's weakness. To Ohia, these dreams were not a condemnation of the giants, but a misdirected judgment meant for someone else. He argued with a desperate, violent logic that the visions were targeted at Azazel, the Watcher who had taught mankind the art of war and weaponry. Why, he asked, would the heavens punish the children who did not ask to be born? It was a compelling argument, a plea of victimhood from the perpetrators of genocide. Ohia and his twin brother Haya clung to this delusion, insisting that the fiery judgments in their nightmares were for their fathers, not for them. They were trying to rationalize the irrational, attempting to find a loophole in the laws of divine justice. But the seed of doubt had been planted too deep to be uprooted by mere bravado. Ohia, sensing he was losing the room, turned his gaze to the darkest corner of the camp, where the most formidable of them all sat in silence: Gilgamesh. This was a being of legendary power, a giant whose strength was whispered about with trembling lips, a creature who could crush mortal armies with a single swing of his fist. Ohia demanded to know what Gilgamesh thought, expecting the warrior to scoff at these nightmares. Instead, Gilgamesh looked up, his face etched with a somber defeat that chilled the others to the bone. The firelight caught the resignation in his dark eyes as he spoke, his voice a low rumble of tectonic plates shifting. He admitted that while he could vanquish any mortal and slay any beast that walked the earth, there was one foe he could not defeat: the ruler of the heavens. Gilgamesh confessed that the time of the wild beast and the wild man was ending. It was a stunning admission of mortality from a being that had lived as a god. Ohia recoiled as if struck physically. The acknowledgement of a power greater than their own was a heresy he could not stomach. In a frantic attempt to regain control of the narrative, he shared his own dream, a vision of a massive tree being uprooted, with only 3 of its roots left in the soil. Desperate to spin this into a victory, he claimed the roots represented the giants, that they were the ones who would remain while the rest of the world was pulled into the sky. He shouted that the judgment was for the mortal rulers, for the humans who had been corrupted by Azazel's teachings, not for the innocent offspring of angels. But his voice sounded hollow, echoing against the silence of a group that no longer believed him. The bravado was a thin veneer over sheer panic. Even as Ohia scoffed and mocked his brothers for their cowardice, the atmosphere in the camp had shifted irrevocably. The monsters were no longer the hunters. They had realized, with a dawning, icy horror, that they were the prey. And as Mawe stared into the dying embers of the fire, watching the shadows dance like drowning men. He knew that arguments and interpretations were useless. The verdict had already been written on the stone tablet in his dream, and the executioner was already on his way. We tend to believe that fear is a biological response reserved for the weak, a survival mechanism for the prey, not the predator. But true terror, the kind that dissolves the soul, does not discriminate based on size or strength. In the obsidian blackness of the antediluvian night, the camp of the giants became an asylum of madness. These titans, who had snapped the spines of lions and drained the oceans of fish, were now waking up screaming, clawing at the empty air, as if fighting off invisible demons. The silence of the night was shattered, not by the roar of beasts, but by the whimpering of monsters. The contagion of prophecy had spread from Maui to the others, and the visions were becoming more specific, more violent, and infinitely more terrifying. It wasn't just abstract shapes anymore. It was a high-definition rendering of their own extinction. One giant, trembling like a leaf in a hurricane, described a new horror, a lush, verdant garden, more beautiful than anything the earth had ever grown, populated by exactly 200 magnificent trees. These trees stood in uniform perfection, tended to by angels, representing the 200 watchers who had descended to earth. But in the blink of an eye, the serenity was incinerated. A cosmic fire roared from the heavens, an inferno of divine judgment that turned the green paradise into a red monstrosity, burning the trees down to ash and leaving nothing but a smoking crater. The symbolism was brutal and inescapable. The trees were their fathers, and the fire was God. Oya, the son of the rebellion's leader, stood amidst the panic with a desperate, furious denial. He gritted his teeth, his jaw muscles working like grinding stones, as he tried to shout down the rising tide of dread. He argued that the burning trees proved his point, that the judgment was solely for the 200 watchers, for the fathers who had sinned, and not for the sons who were merely the result. He paced around the fire, casting a shadow that swallowed the camp, demanding they ignore the nightmares. But his authority was crumbling. The silence that followed his outburst wasn't one of respect. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of doubt. Maui, staring into the flames, realized that if the tree is burned to the root, the fruit cannot survive. The logic of exemption was a lie. The panic needed a solution, not a speech. Then, a voice from the back of the pack squeaked out a name that would change the trajectory of their fate. Enoch, the Scribe, the man who walked with God. It was a humiliating suggestion for a giant, to seek wisdom from a mere mortal, a creature they usually looked upon as food. But Enoch was no ordinary human. He was an anomaly, a man who traversed the boundaries of dimensions, a conduit to the very power that was haunting their sleep. The suggestion to consult the human scribe ignited a powder keg of jealousy in Ohia. He whipped his head around, his neck cracking with the speed of his rage, appalled that his brothers would value the word of a fragile biological worm over his own royal lineage. He mocked them, swinging his massive head like an axe, challenging their courage and their intellect. But the fear of the unknown is a powerful motivator, stronger even than the fear of a leader. A chorus of voices rose up, chanting Enoch's name, a desperate plea for answers that drowned out Ohia's bravado. Defeated by the collective anxiety of his kin, Ohia finally relented, though his permission was dripped in venom. He told Mawe to go, to find his precious Enoch, effectively washing his hands of the mission. Mawe didn't hesitate. He took to the skies, launching his gargantuan frame into the air with the force of a takeoff that shook the ground. He flew like a bird of prey, soaring over the scarred landscape his kind had ruined, heading toward the land of desolation, a barren spiritual wasteland where the Scribe was known to dwell, isolated from the sins of the world. Mawe found him in the heart of the emptiness. Enoch stood there, a speck of dust in the vast desert, yet radiating a calmness that unnerved the giant. For the first time in his life, Mawe, a being who could crush boulders with his bare hands, felt compelled to kneel. He lowered himself into the dirt, humbling himself before the human, and poured out the story of the nightmares, the tablet in the water, the burning garden, the terrifying certainty of doom. He begged for an interpretation, for a loophole, for a way to stop the visions. Enoch listened with the stoicism of a man who has seen the machinery of the universe and is no longer impressed by its monsters. But the answer Mawe wanted was not his to give. Enoch explained that these dreams were direct transmissions from the Lord God, encrypted messages that only the Creator could fully unlock. However, he offered a sliver of hope. He would petition the Almighty. He would stand in the gap between the monsters and the Maker, and ask for the meaning of their sentence. As Mawe prepared to leave, hopeful that his diplomacy had worked, Enoch grabbed one of the giant's massive fingers, anchoring him with a grip that felt surprisingly strong. The Scribe offered a final cryptic warning that felt like a prophecy in itself. He told the giant to beware of the sun. He warned that flying too close to the solar fire would result in being scorched and obliterated. It was a practical warning for an aviator, but in the context of their doom, it felt like a metaphor for their entire existence. They had flown too close to divinity, and now they were about to burn. Mawe nodded, glancing at the furious, blinding orb in the sky, and took flight, returning to the camp where Ohia waited with a sneer. "Empty-handed," Ohia scoffed, seeing no weapon or shield in Mawe's grasp. But Mawe had brought back something far more dangerous than a weapon. He had brought back the attention of God. And as the giants settled in to wait for Enoch's return, the air grew heavy with the static of a coming storm, for they did not yet know that the answer to their question would not come in the form of salvation, but in the form of water. Hope is a cruel thing. It is the anesthetic we apply to a fatal wound, believing it will stop the bleeding, but in the end, it only prolongs the realization of death. For the giants, hope was the poison that kept them paralyzed in the dirt, waiting for a salvation that was never coming. Days turned into a grueling vigil of silence. The sun that Enoch had warned Mawe about beat down on their massive, anxious bodies, baking the dread into their skin. Mawe watched the horizon until his eyes burned, his trust in the human scribe beginning to rot into resentment. It seemed the little man had abandoned them to their nightmares. But then, emerging from the heat haze like a specter of judgment, Enoch returned. He did not come with a smile, nor with open arms. He carried a tablet, a slab of divine law that felt heavier than the mountains the giants used as footstools. He walked into the camp of monsters, not as a guest, but as a prosecutor reading a death sentence to a cage of rabid animals. Enoch's voice was calm, a terrifying contrast to the chaotic thunder of the giants' hearts. He told them that he had petitioned the Lord of Spirits, that he had begged for clemency on their behalf, but the gates of mercy had been slammed shut. The tablet he held was a dossier of their crimes, a cosmic indictment that spared no one. It listed Semyaza, Azazel, and every fallen angel who had twisted the laws of nature. It condemned the human women who had birthed these abominations, and it condemned the sons who now stood trembling before him. Enoch read the words that made the blood of the Nephilim run cold. The earth itself was screaming. The ground they walked on had filed a complaint against them, crying out under the weight of their violence and their hunger. The verdict was total annihilation. The archangels were already donning their armor, preparing to descend and wipe the slate clean, followed by a deluge of water that would scour the history of the giants from the bedrock of the world. But then, Enoch offered a single, fragile thread of possibility. He told them to pray. He told them to bend their knees, to beg for forgiveness with genuine hearts, and perhaps, just perhaps, the Almighty might stay his hand. The camp exploded. This suggestion of surrender was the spark that ignited the powder keg of Ohia's pride. The son of Semyaza did not see a lifeline. He saw an insult. He stormed toward Enoch, the ground shaking with each footfall, his shadow engulfing the small scribe. He roared, calling Enoch a little man, a worm who dared to lecture gods about morality. Haya, his twin and shadow, echoed the rage, ready to crush the messenger simply because they hated the message. But Enoch didn't flinch. He didn't scream, he didn't run, and he didn't beg. He stood his ground with a look of amusement, like a man who knows the punchline of a joke that everyone else is too stupid to understand. He had seen the throne of God. He had seen the engines of the universe turn. Two angry giants were nothing compared to the cosmic horror he had witnessed in the heavens. Before Ohia could turn the scribe into a stain on the desert floor, Mahwe stepped in. He placed his massive bulk between the aggressor and the prophet, a physical wall of flesh protecting the only link they had to survival. The confrontation was the final fracture of their species. Mahwe pleaded with his brother, arguing that killing the messenger would achieve nothing but a faster death. He saw the logic in surrender, the pragmatism in begging. If there was a 1% chance that prayer could stop the archangels, he was going to take it. But Ohia was made of different stuff. He looked at Mahwe with disgust, spitting on the idea of being lectured by a human or bowing to a silent god. If the angels were coming, let them come. If the heavens wanted a war, Ohia would give them one. He declared he would fight them all, raising a club that was essentially a tree trunk, his eyes burning with a defiance that was both majestic and suicidal. He looked around the camp for allies, for warriors who shared his bloodlust, but he was met with the pathetic sight of monsters learning how to cower. The scene that followed was a grotesque tragedy. As Ohia and Haya turned their backs on the camp, storming off into the wasteland to face their doom on their feet, the rest of the giants collapsed to their knees. It was a clumsy, awkward surrender. These were creatures built for slaughter, not for piety. They glanced at each other nervously, unsure of the mechanics of prayer, whispering clumsy apologies to a sky that was already turning gray with storm clouds. Mawe knelt in the dust, clasping his hands, forcing himself to believe that this humiliation would save him. He watched Ohia's silhouette disappear over the ridge, the brother he would never see again, the warrior walking blindly toward a war he couldn't win. And as Mawe closed his eyes to pray, he didn't realize that Ohia was right about one thing. Repentance was just another form of bargaining, and the time for bargaining had ended long ago. There is a common misconception that the Great Flood was a natural disaster, a tragic weather event that simply spiraled out of control. But that is a comforting lie. The flood was a military operation. It was a coordinated, tactical strike designed to liquidate a specific enemy force. And the soldiers sent to execute this mission were not the benevolent cherubs of Renaissance paintings, but entities of terrifying, silent violence. In the days that followed Enoch's departure, the prediction of doom solidified into reality. The archangels descended from the firmament, not to offer salvation, but to wrestle the earth from the grip of the monsters who had held it hostage. They moved with the cold precision of reapers, quartering the giants and cutting them down like wheat meeting the sickle. Mercy was not a currency that held any value here. It was total extermination. The carnage that unfolded was psychological as much as it was physical. The archangel Gabriel, a being of immense power, did not simply strike them down. He cast a spell of madness upon them, twisting their minds until the brotherhood of the pack dissolved into a frenzy of fratricide. The giants turned on each other, their eyes clouded with a magically induced psychosis, tearing their kin apart while the angels watched. Those who tried to fight back against the heavens were crushed instantly by Gabriel's strength, and one giant was sent flying for acres, his massive body ragdolled by a single sonic blast from the entity's trumpet. But the most tragic sight was not the violence, but the stillness. Mawe, the giant who had advocated for peace, remained on his knees. He and his followers were still muttering prayers, eyes squeezed shut, clinging to the desperate, delusional hope that their piety would act as a shield. They truly believed that if they prayed hard enough, the consequences of their atrocities would vanish. They were wrong. As Mahwe watched the archangel Gabriel butcher his praying brothers without hesitation, a cold realization washed over him. Ohia was right. Prayer was useless. Surrender was death. They would all die just the same, and his last moment was spent in the crushing regret of a pacifist who realized too late that he was standing in a slaughterhouse. While the land was being bathed in blood, the water began to rise. The flood came exactly as foretold, a relentless, churning wall of destruction that swallowed the burning forests and the ruined cities. Perched high on the precipice of a crumbling cliff, Ohia stood as the last witness to the end of the world. Below him, he could see the fires of their camp hissing into steam, and the black plume of smoke marking the grave of his civilization. In the distance, bobbing on the violent waves, was the Ark, a wooden tomb of life carrying Noah, the very man Mahwe had seen on the tablet, safe and dry, while the sons of angels drowned. Ohia wondered if Mahwe was dead, dismissing him as a stupid, idealistic fool for thinking God would listen. And he knew in his heart that forgiveness was never an option. Beside him stood his brother Haya, trembling as the water lapped at their feet, erasing the land inch by inch. They were trapped. There was nowhere left to run. But the ocean had one final horror to reveal. As they stared into the abyss, Ohia spotted something moving in the water. something too massive to be a whale, too ancient to be a shark, and bigger than any giant who had ever walked the earth. It was a creature of nightmare, possessed of black, scaly skin that thundered through the foam, pulsating with a radioactive purple glow. The water around it boiled as it surfaced, a silhouette long and twisting like a bloated snake, driven by an insatiable hunger. Haya, paralyzed by the sheer scale of the beast, asked what kind of god would create such a monster. It was the Leviathan. Before Ohia could even scream a warning, the beast lunged. It didn't fight, it simply consumed. Haya was there 1 second, and the next he was crunched between rows of serrated teeth, his life extinguished in a single, wet snap. Witnessing his twin brother reduced to meat should have broken Ohia, but instead it unlocked a primal berserker rage. He was the last giant, the final remnant of a dying species, and he would not die on his knees. He launched himself into the air, soaring toward the beast with his club raised high, a scream of defiance tearing from his throat. He landed on the monster's head, raining blows down between its eyes. Once, twice, 3 times, until the ringing in his ears was deafening. He struck until his club shattered, until the scales were ripped away, and his hands were covered in the gore of a sea god. When the weapon was gone, he used his feet, stomping the beast's skull with the force of a pile driver, screaming in unison with the dying monster. He dug his fists into its eyes, bursting them in a shower of fluid, tunneling into the hollow space of its skull until the Leviathan stopped moving. He had done the impossible. He had killed the unkillable beast. Thrown from the carcass, Ohia landed hard on the cliffside, his chest heaving, vomiting seawater and adrenaline. He lay there for a moment, watching the corpse of the Leviathan sink beneath the rising tide, and he began to laugh. It was a manic, broken sound, a mixture of triumph and grief. He had won. He had defeated the monster. But he had forgotten that his enemy was not the sea. It was the sky. He heard the soft, precise beating of wings behind him. He didn't even have time to turn around. A blade of divine metal pierced his back, a concise, brutal stab that exited through his chest. His body went instantly cold, an unnatural chill that froze his very soul. He tried to swing a fist, to fight one last time, but his limbs refused to obey. As his vision dimmed and the darkness took him, the last sound Ohia heard was not the roar of the ocean, but the smacking of an angel's lips as it prepared to blow a long, final blast on a trumpet. The floodwaters rose to the heights of the sky, scrubbing the earth clean of the giant filth. But while their bodies were destroyed, their story did not end in the mud. It is said that the souls of the giants, bitter and vengeful, were denied entry to the afterlife. They remained here, invisible and hateful, transforming into the evil spirits that continue to torment humanity to this very day. So the next time you feel a sudden, irrational rage, ask yourself, is it you? Or is it the ghost of a giant, still fighting a war he lost 5,000 years ago? We treat history as if it were a solid, unchangeable timeline carved in stone. But the truth is far more fragile. It is a collection of rotting scraps buried in the desert, waiting for a Bedouin shepherd to shatter a clay jar and let the ghosts out. The story of the giants was not found in a pristine library in Rome or a cathedral in London. It was discovered in 1947, hidden in the suffocating darkness of the Qumran caves near the Dead Sea. These were the Dead Sea Scrolls, ancient texts written on parchment that had turned brittle and brown like dried skin, preserved by the dry heat of the wilderness for 2,000 years. Among these crumbling fragments was the Book of Giants, a text that offers a rare, terrifying glimpse into the perspective of the monsters themselves. This Aramaic version, dated to around 300 BC, alongside a later version penned by the Parthian prophet Mani in the 3rd century AD, paints a picture that is frustratingly incomplete. The scrolls are tattered, moth-eaten, and fragmentary, meaning that modern scholars are forced to act as forensic detectives, piecing together a crime scene where the victims have been dead for millennia. We are missing the middle, we are missing the context, and most hauntingly, we are often missing the end. The narrative you just heard is a reconstruction, a stitching together of two different nightmares. The Aramaic text from the Dead Sea is bleak and abrupt. It ends with Enoch delivering a grim warning that judgment is inevitable, leaving the fate of Mahweh and Ohia to our imagination. It is a story of psychological torture, where the giants are paralyzed by the fear of a god they cannot fight. However, the Manichaean version offers a more cinematic, violent conclusion. It is here, in the writings of a Gnostic prophet, that we find the descriptions of the spectacular battle against the Leviathan and the archangels. Mani, drawing from ancient Iranian and Mesopotamian mythology, injected the story with high-octane chaos, introducing the sea monster and the final stand of the brothers Ohia and Haya against the archangel Raphael. It reads almost like ancient fan fiction, a desperate attempt to give these titanic villains a worthy send-off, transforming their execution into a war. By merging these texts, we get a fuller, more disturbing picture of the antediluvian world, a place where angels and demons didn't just whisper in ears, but engaged in physical, bloody combat on a dying earth. What makes the Book of Giants so uniquely unsettling is not the violence, but the empathy. In the standard biblical narrative, and even in the Book of Enoch, the Nephilim are portrayed as mindless eating machines, biological weapons that exist only to destroy. They are stripped of personality, treated as a virus that God has to cure with water. But the Book of Giants commits a dangerous heresy. It humanizes the monsters. Here, the giants are not just eating and killing, they are dreaming. They suffer from anxiety. They hold council meetings. They debate the morality of their actions, and they feel the crushing weight of existential dread. Mahweh is shown worrying about his bread and his home, a mundane human concern for a creature that eats lions for breakfast. This narrative choice forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility, that these beings, despite their grotesque origins, possessed souls capable of fear, regret, and perhaps even a twisted form of love. It suggests that the Great Flood was not just a natural disaster, but a divine execution of sentient beings who knew they were going to die and were terrified of the dark. This brings us to the enigma of Enoch himself. In the Bible, he is a ghost of a character, occupying only a few cryptic verses in Genesis that state, "He walked with God, and he was not, for God took him." He is the only man to bypass death, abducted by the Creator for purposes unknown. But in these pseudepigraphical texts, Enoch is the central figure of the cosmic drama, a diplomat shuttling between the fallen angels in the abyss and the throne of the Almighty. The Book of Giants reinforces this role, showing him as a reluctant intermediary who pities the monsters but cannot save them. It creates a terrifying hierarchy where even the strongest giants are powerless before the Scribe, and the Scribe is powerless before God. The ancient Essenes, the mystical Jewish sect believed to have hidden these scrolls, viewed this not as mythology, but as history. To them, the giants were real, tangible threats that had nearly driven humanity to extinction, and the flood was a necessary surgical sterilization of the planet. But the most chilling implication of the text is not about what happened in the past, but what is happening right now. The ancient traditions hold that while the physical bodies of the giants were drowned in the flood or butchered by archangels, their souls were forbidden from entering heaven. They were too divine to simply vanish, but too corrupt to be redeemed. So what happens to the soul of a monster when its body dies? It stays. It lingers. The texts suggest that the evil spirits and demons that plague humanity today, the invisible forces of malice, madness, and possession, are actually the disembodied ghosts of the giants. They are the spirits of the Nephilim, stripped of their flesh, wandering the earth they once ruled, bitter, hungry, and eternally vengeful. They can no longer eat our flesh, so they torment our minds. So the next time you feel a presence in an empty room, or a sudden, unexplained wave of anger, you have to ask yourself a question that has no comforting answer. Are you alone, or are you standing in the shadow of a giant? There is a final, uncomfortable irony buried in the mud of the deluge. We look back at the giants as mistakes, as biological errors that needed to be erased to save the planet. Yet, in their final moments, these so-called monsters displayed a capacity for introspection, fear, and prayer that rivaled the most devout saints. They begged for redemption while the sky fell, proving they possessed a consciousness desperate for the light. Consider the terrifying possibility that the evil we fear wasn't just in their blood, but in the silence of the God who refused to answer them. We celebrate the flood as a victory of good over evil, but perhaps it was simply a victory of order over chaos, and order has no heart. This isn't just ancient history. It is a diagnosis of the modern soul. The texts claim the spirits of the giants remain on earth as invisible tormentors, the architects of our darker impulses. Think about your own life, the sudden irrational rage, the bottomless hunger for status, the paralyzing anxiety that wakes you at 3 a.m. We like to call it human nature, but the ancients knew better. They believed we are haunted by the ghosts of a dead race, forcing us to fight the same war they lost 5,000 years ago. You are not just fighting your own demons. You are fighting the echoes of the Nephilim. So I leave you with a choice that splits the moral universe in two. If you stood in the shoes of the Almighty, looking down at a monster on its knees, begging for forgiveness, do you offer the hand of mercy because it has a soul, or do you swing the sword of justice because it is a beast? The waters have receded, but the entities that caused the flood are still out there, waiting in the void. Next, we will open the forbidden files on the angels who didn't fall, but descended with swords of fire to enforce the silence. Subscribe and ring the bell. The watchers are always watching, and it is time you started watching back.